I didn't really come here because I wanted to help others. I came here because I need to be here. Okay? That's the real reason I came, because I've been without CR for a little while at different points in times, and it affects me. You go a couple steps backwards, but you get back in the program, and get back on board, and you just keep moving forward. So let me just open in prayer. Father God, Lord, just as that last song said, I am grateful that you are always here with us, and that with you there is no being a failure, because you love each and every one of us the same. And even if we think we are failing in something, it more than likely is because you're closing the door and you have something so much better planned for us. So tonight, Lord, I just hope that some of my story that I'm going to share is able to help someone else and lift them up, and to know that they're not alone in their situation that they're in. It's in your name I pray. Amen. So, as you heard, my name is Kelly. I'm a grateful follower and believer in Jesus Christ. I've struggled with many issues in my lifetime, just as many of you have, I'm sure. Some of my hurts, habits, and hang-ups include abandonment issues, insecurity, trust issues, love and relationship addiction, and inappropriate relationships. I've dealt with guilt, shame, and anger. I've also struggled with self-confidence issues, grief, and the inability to love myself. To be honest, there have been times in my life where I didn't feel like I was qualified to stand up here and give a testimony. I didn't feel like my struggles ranked up with other struggles, such as drug addiction or alcohol addiction, or just some of the things that have happened to other people that I've met throughout this journey, and some of the things that they've dealt with in their life. I didn't feel like the things that I've gone through were comparable to what they have been gone through in their life. But then listening to some of the CR meetings that we've had and done throughout the program, I quickly realized that if there are things in your life which are preventing you from loving yourself or from loving others, and most importantly, loving God and allowing God to love you, then those things are worth talking about. Those things are worth working on for your own healing. Romans 9:28 says, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them." So even though there are times when I feel like some of the struggles I've had in my life are not that big compared to everyone else, I know that God is using those for good to help others. So I was born into a family after my mother was told she could not have any children. She was 38 years old when she had me, and it was her second marriage. When I was born, I had 3 half-brothers who were a lot older than me, ranging anywhere from 16 to 20 years older than what I was. None of them lived at home with myself and my parents. When I was a young child, I learned very quickly that I was Daddy's little girl. My dad spoiled me rotten, even though he wasn't around much. I had more toys than a family of 5 kids would have. My dad was always bringing me toys or a bag of candy or a barrel of snacks. I could do no wrong in Daddy's eyes. My dad even told my mom that she was not allowed to punish me, and that was probably the first mistake of my life. During the early years, like I said, my dad wasn't around much. Mom and I spent a lot of time home alone. She didn't like to travel much, so we didn't really go outside of the small town we lived in. We didn't really have extra money to do things outside of the house. But once or twice a week, the telephone would ring, and that's when they still hung on the wall, and you had to go to them and answer them. And after a brief conversation, my mom would say, "Come on, we're going to go to the Moose with Daddy." The Moose was the Fraternal Order of Moose, which is a club like the VFW or the American Legion. These types of places weren't considered bars in my family's eyes because they were more family-oriented. Kids could go and you could sit down and you could have a meal there. But I loved to go to the Moose to see my dad. After all, I was Daddy's little girl. I'd been going there for as long as I could remember. Everyone knew me, and I always got lots of attention, which later in life turned out to contribute, I believe, to some of my struggles. I would sit on my dad's knee at the bar. That's when kids were allowed to sit at the bar. And my dad would lay money on the bar and say, "There you go." And that money was for me to gamble with. I'd play the punch boards until there was no money left. And then when that ran out, if he wasn't ready to leave yet, more money would be laid in front of me. Sometimes my brothers were there too. Usually the wives and their children didn't come. But when my brothers were there, most of those times they wouldn't turn out too good. You see, when my dad and my brothers would get together, they drank. And they really drank. They would get into mouth battles with the people who were sitting around the bar. They would sometimes get into battles with each other. And it would usually end up with words, attitudes, and sometimes even fistfights, something no young child should have to be exposed to. As the years went by and the rules were changed that kids weren't allowed to sit at the bar anymore, I was left to just roam around the club. I would talk to all the patrons, who at that time were mostly men. They didn't have a lot of women, and women weren't even allowed to be members of the club. They were only allowed to come in if a man brought them in. These men taught me how to play card games like poker and pitch. I was often my brother's partner in these card games. Can you imagine a poker table full of grown men and I come and sit down to play at 8 years old? If they didn't know already, they were about to find out just how good I was. My brother also taught me how to play a mean game of pool. Everyone was always nice to me, and if they weren't, they were sure to hear about it. Some would buy me soda, some would buy me or give me $1 for a candy bar, and some would give me money to play the pinball machine. When somebody hit the gambling jackpot, so did I. Money was always tossed my way. And back then it was completely appropriate for each of these men to ask to give me a hug or a kiss on the cheek. After all, they were being nice to me, and they seemed really nice, and my dad was okay with it. As a child, I remember my dad coming home on many occasions, stumbling in the door. He and my mom never spoke much. He would usually end up laying on the couch and passing out. On one occasion, I was trying to wake him up to see if he wanted to eat dinner. He woke up incredibly angry and pushed me across the room, and I stumbled into the corner cabinet. At the same time, he was telling me to get away. He didn't want anything to do with me. Imagine how that felt to a little girl who loved her daddy so much. I can still to this day vividly replay that scene over and over in my head. The following mornings, I would wake up and find him and Mom sitting at the kitchen table having coffee. But again, I don't remember a great deal of conversation between the two of them. When my dad wasn't working, or at the Moose, the VFW, the Republican Club, the Eagles, the Hanover Hotel, the Franklin House, or any of the other establishments he frequented, we might have been doing something with who, at the time, I believed to be my parents' best friends. I remember spending lots of time with this other couple, both at their house and at ours. And usually they were mostly good times. I remember a camping trip where I got to go see Evel Knievel jump his motorcycle over a bunch of cars. That was really cool. Then there was another time where we were visiting some friends and we got stuck fishing on the lake in the middle of a thunderstorm. I caught my first fish that day. We would occasionally visit my brother's homes, but my nieces and nephews were the same age as me, so I ended up playing with them instead of really visiting with my brothers and their wives. No matter what we did, though, there was usually beer involved. For as long as I can remember, my dad would tell me to go get him another beer, and I learned early in life how to open the cans and the bottles, and my reward for doing this for him was always to take the first sip. During those single-digit age years, my dad owned a motorcycle business, and I spent a lot of time there. One day, I was sitting in the office pretending to do my office work when my dad called me out to the showroom. He was standing there with another man. My dad said, "I want you to meet your brother," insert name. I remember being very confused. I already knew who my 3 brothers were, but now Dad was telling me I had another? There was no really further explanation, just a hug and a nice to meet you, sis. I didn't really understand, but I trusted my dad, and I was really young. So suddenly I had 4 big brothers and not 3. I have since learned that I also have a big sister too, but nobody has any information on her. We never attended church as a family. My mom was Catholic, but due to a divorce early in her life, the Catholic Church is one of those, in those days, shunned people who were divorced. Even though my mom wouldn't attend church because of her divorce, she wanted to make sure I knew about Jesus. I would go to church occasionally with my uncle and my cousin. My mom's family was very prominent in the Catholic Church, even though she no longer attended. But she was able to talk to the Monsignor and get him to enroll me in a special program where I was able to have my first communion and my Holy Confirmation completed within 2 years. That normally took any other child from kindergarten to 8th grade to do so. I thought I was pretty special. While this taught me about Jesus, I certainly didn't have a relationship with him. As years passed, my dad spent even less time at home. My brothers were too busy with their own families or doing their own thing, so I don't really have many memories with them. My mom and dad eventually separated. I remember on many occasions after that where my dad would come to our house drunk in the middle of the night. And this is when I learned my father and the wife of the best friends were having it wasn't really an affair anymore because they had all separated, but they were in a relationship together. And because he was coming to our house in the middle of the night, that meant they were probably fighting. I knew that my mom still loved my dad, since even though they were no longer living at the same house, he would show up drunk at 1 or 2 in the morning, and a little bit later, I would know they were having sex. This is how I was taught what love was all about. There wasn't any boundaries. Give the man you loved what he wanted, and he would keep coming back, telling you that he loved you. As a teen, there was little involvement in my life with anyone but my mom or my school girlfriends. Mom worked and took care of the house, which Dad allowed us to live in. We lived in a neighborhood where there were several manufacturing plants. There was only 3 houses on our block. I learned that when I took our dog for a walk, the men at these factories would pay attention to me. They would provoke me to show a little more with their words and whistles. I even received my first real kiss from one of these men. At the time, it made me feel good. You see, in school, I was terribly teased for my large, thick lens glasses. My self-confidence was non-existent, but the guys thought I looked great, or so I thought. I was finally getting attention from someone other than my mother. I started taking many walks and bike rides around the neighborhood. My mom tried to start disciplining me, and I gave her nothing but grief and attitude. I left her home a lot, too. That is what I thought was okay, since she and I were always home alone my entire childhood. I would often ride my bike across town to visit my grandfather, who was my mother's father. He was elderly and lived alone. One day, while I was giving him a kiss goodbye, he started to fondle my chest. When I told him I needed to leave, he held me tightly around my waist, trying to get me to stay, telling me everything was okay and that he loved me and that he just wanted to hold me close. But I was physically stronger than him and broke away. And I rode straight home, but I never told my mom why I never wanted to go back to see Papa again. Several years later, I confessed this to a cousin and was told, "That's what old people do. They're all like that." I also began babysitting for a family member. I loved babysitting. It made me feel responsible, and I was out of the house. My mom would usually come pick me up when it was time to leave. However, one night, the husband told my mom it was silly for her to run out in the cold, late night, and since their car was warm from just coming home, he would bring me home. On that ride home, he laid his hand on my shoulder and began telling me how thankful he was that I would come over and give them a break from the kids. He continued to say how he wanted to get me know me better if I was okay with that, as he slid his hand down the front of my chest. I grabbed his hand saying no and just hoped and prayed we would be back to my house soon, and I never went back again to babysit. These events all led to me thinking that the only way guys were going to be interested in me is if I allowed them to touch me. I became promiscuous with a number of boys or men that I came in contact with. Looking back at it now, I can see that I would search out men who would talk to me and pay attention to me. At 16 or 17 years old, I had a boy that would come stay at my house because I would yell and scream at my mom if she said no, and I would keep doing it until she would just give in. And you'll find out later how that relationship turned out. My mom passed when I was 54, not when I was 54 years old. My goodness, I'm not even there yet. My mom passed when she was 54 years old, and I was only 17. She had cancer, which I believe she hid from all of the family as long as she could. I only knew for about 5 months before she died. I still don't think I have ever really grieved over my mom's death. I didn't even cry at her funeral. I was so mean to her in the months before her death. She was the one person who loved me unconditionally and would do anything for me. She was the only one to attend every function I was involved in. She would spend her last dollar just so I could go to the late night roller skate, and then she would come pick me up when it was over. My father never came to any events I was involved in. I was so angry at God for taking her away. I was so confused. I was taught at church how good God was, but he took my mom, my rock, away from me. And this was the next step in my downward spiral. It was my senior year of high school when my mom passed. I had 3 months of school left. I had to move in with my dad and his girlfriend into a house of constant drinking and fighting. I still had the boyfriend. He wasn't the best boyfriend, but he paid attention to me, sometimes with his foul language and rough physical nature. I spent time together with as many friends as I could just so I didn't have to be at the house. As soon as I graduated, I moved out and moved in with him. That is when the physical abuse started. If he didn't like what I said or did, he was sure to let me know. But then he would quickly turn right around and tell me how much he loved me. Similar to like my dad would tell my mom, except my dad never physically abused my mom. Things between the boyfriend and I continued to get worse, and I had to have a protection order put against him. Shortly after that, I discovered I was pregnant. I tried to do the right thing and tell him the news. That ended up in a big argument in which there was a physical altercation. I made the choice at the time to abort the pregnancy, being sure that at a young age there was no way I could handle a baby, especially when there was no guarantee the abuse didn't harm the baby, and I didn't want that child to suffer like I was. After I moved out on my own, I didn't really ever see any more of my family. In my early 20s, I spent many nights at nightclubs and bars. My friends and I had a weekly schedule. Every night except Monday, there was a place to be. It was where I felt the most comfortable. I already knew how to BS my way around the bar. It was easy to talk to men there. I'd been doing that since I could walk and talk. I craved attention. I was very impulsive with men, seeking their attention. That impulsiveness sometimes ended in sexual encounters within the first few days of speaking to a guy. After all, that's how it worked, right? When you care about someone, you had sex with them. At least that's what I thought. I ended up pregnant again to a guy I met at a club. He told me to choose him or to choose the baby, but this time I was smart and I was keeping that baby. A week later, I went to pick up my things from his place and I found him in bed with someone else already. I was so hurt. Why couldn't I keep a relationship, or why couldn't I find a person who wanted to only be with me? The pattern didn't stop. I met another guy while I was 3 months pregnant, and he promised to love me and my child. We got involved in a church. I even sang on the worship team. About 2 years after my son was born, this man decided that marijuana and other women were more important, and he walked out. This stirred up all my abandonment issues. My self-esteem was pretty low, and I never really felt good enough for anybody. After all, no one ever stuck around. I never had any confidence in myself. I pushed away most of my friends as well. I could not make connections with friends for fear they would walk out of my life, and that led me to feeling more alone and worthless. On the weekends I didn't have my son, I took on what I thought was the perfect part-time job for me, bartending and cocktail waitressing. But this job was also meant that it was hard for me to get up to go to church on Sunday mornings. In this new job, I got lots of attention. It may have been negative attention, but it was better than no attention at all. I turned to men because it made me feel good about myself. My addiction to men was the ally for me to gain importance to others, even if it was only for a moment. I needed an outlet for the pain of feeling unlovable, so I sought after sex, thinking that if they had sex with me, I must be good enough for them. In my mind, sex meant love, and therefore when sex happened, I felt wanted and loved. But in reality, it was just causing more pain in my life, and usually in a few days, I was lonely again. The pattern continued for years, some relationships lasting longer than others, but all ending the same way. I entered a deep depression, barely eating, and was not managing my money very well. One year, the church even needed to provide me with Christmas presents for my son. That was very embarrassing for me. I wanted to change, but I didn't know how. I was still going to church on Sundays, but it wasn't helping. The next few years, to be honest, are pretty much a blur for me. I wasn't out drinking my thoughts away. I actually hated drinking because I had seen so much of it in my life. I was in just so much pain that I buried memories so deeply that I didn't want to recall them. I craved any small amount of attention. I turned very codependent, trying to help others as much as I could, just hoping they would like me in the end. 7 years after my son was born, I met a man who hung around for a while, and by a while, I mean more than a few weeks. However, not too many months into the relationship, I ended up pregnant, even though I was on birth control. We decided to marry before the baby was born. We found a nice church, a preacher who counseled us, and agreed to marry us. I enjoyed that church, and I taught Sunday school there. My husband was a former Marine, and he had that commanding voice. He was never physical, but the tone of his voice was enough for me to withdraw. There was no real communication because I was still lacking confidence from the effects of the abuse I had suffered 15 plus years earlier, in where I was afraid to speak my own mind. When my daughter was born, she had several health issues, and at that time, I took that as a sign of punishment from God. After all, I had aborted a child so many years prior because I didn't want a child that I was unsure of, and now here I was in the exact same situation. What I didn't know at the time was that baby girl was going to teach me a lot of lessons and be one of my greatest blessings. As you could probably guess, that marriage didn't last either. And now I really felt unlovable. 2 failed marriages. The person in my life who loved me unconditionally was taken from me at age 17, and I was still alone. I stopped going to church. I had messed up so much in my life. How could God want me? I wish at this time I would have focused more on Psalms 34:18 that says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed." God was there to rescue me. I just wasn't looking for that at the time. The next few years, I moved around a lot with my kids, but usually it was for a man or to another man's house. But I always made sure that my kids knew that their mother loved them, I could support them on my own, and I would always be there for them. I thought I was always putting them first by being fully involved in their lives, but in reality, the attention from the men was what really came first. Having 2 kids makes it a little tougher to get attention from men, but I still seeked it. Through the passing years, I began to get bitter, angry, and mean. From years of sitting in the bars, I listened to people be smart alecks with each other, and it wasn't always in a fun, joking way. This is a learned behavior for me, which I continued into adulthood, and which got worse during these years. As I was trying to figure out this whole love man thing, I started putting elevated expectations on others. Subconsciously, I wanted them to fail me, as if then it would justify my belief that I was unwanted and unloved. Instead of realizing each person is unique and has their own perceptions, I falsely believed that everyone should adapt to what I wanted and what I expected from them. I was constantly let down because this theory is impossible. This behavior in turn ruined a lot of good relationships that I had entered. I knew that something had to change, that there were some very hurtful things said to me and about me. While it was very painful to hear, it did help me to start to take a deep look inside myself. I started to put on masks so that people would not know the real me. I didn't want to share my life with anyone, not the past life, not the current life. I spent many weeks and many months alone. I had spent almost 2 years living in an apartment with just me and my daughter, the longest in my lifetime that I had ever been without a man constantly around. I was so lonely, but I knew I needed to work towards changing the behaviors I had been living. It was October of 2010 when a woman I worked with was telling me about this new church she was attending and asked me to join her one Sunday. That church was York Christian Church, now known as Connection Christian Church. It had been a long time since I had gone to church. I decided one weekend to go. This church was a little different. People seemed very welcoming and talked to me from the moment I walked in the door. Before each service, the overhead screens would show announcements of church events, and one of those was for Celebrate Recovery. The first time I saw it, I thought, oh, how nice, they have an AA program here at the church. There's so much alcohol infused into my life growing up. I'm glad they really want to help people, but it's not really anything I needed to worry about. Well, that announcement for CR kept jumping out at me week after week. As much as I tried not to look at that announcement, it was like it would just hover in front of my eyes until I looked at it. One Friday night, I was doing some retail therapy at the mall across the street from the church. I came out of the mall and it was about 10 minutes till 7, and I looked up and the church was all lit up, and I remembered they were having that Celebrate Recovery program. I thought to myself, I need to go see what this is all about, because I'm nosy. I tried to be as invisible as possible. I didn't want to make eye contact with anyone. After all, why was I going to a place where they were talking about recovery? I never was an alcoholic. I never touched drugs in my life. As soon as the meeting was over, I ran out of the door before anyone could get me into the women's group to talk. I made sure that no one saw me there. During that weekend, I was telling my best friend about what I did. My best friend had been my rock. We were friends since we were 20 years old. She asked me if I was going to go back the following week. And my response? I don't know. It's about recovery. I don't really need to be there. My best friend responded with something that just resonated in me and wouldn't leave my thoughts. She said, "You've always enjoyed being in church, and that's when I've always seen you at your happiest." And you know what? She was right. There is something about worship that lights a fire in me and puts a spring in my step. 2 weeks later, I returned to the Celebrate Recovery meeting again. The very first step. Step 1, I admit that I am powerless to control my tendency to do the wrong things and that my life is unmanageable. Boy, that was really true about my life. I felt powerless and my life was really out of control. Romans 7:18 says, "For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out." Who knew that putting that up there on that screen would affect me the way that it did? I was ready to run out the door, and I really tried. But the pastor was right there inside the door. He grabbed me, he hugged me, and he acted as though he had known me for years. He convinced me to go sit in on the women's group, and this was very intimidating to me. These people had no idea who I was, and I surely wasn't about to let them know at that time either. After introductions, I only said my name. Remember, I didn't think I had any issues. People started sharing their stories. Tears started flowing down my cheeks. In about 15 minutes, I was in full crying mode. I couldn't talk, I just sobbed. I left as quickly as I could. That Saturday, I ran into the pastor's wife at church, and we had a brief chat. I told her how embarrassed I was and how I didn't think I would come back after those people seeing me acting like that. She promised to be right by my side, and I didn't have to share anything I didn't want to. And that started my journey. I needed this program. My next few visits to Celebrate Recovery were all the same. I sat and I sobbed. I slowly learned how to trust these ladies and how to share just a small piece of my story at a time. I was starting to realize that recovery wasn't just for addicts. It's for all the hurts, habits, and hang-ups I had been experiencing in my life. All along, I thought the thing missing from my life was the attention of a man or the male presence in my life, when in reality what I was missing was Jesus Christ. After a few months of Friday night CR, a new 12-step study program was being offered, and I decided it was time to face my deep hurts. I was about a month or so into the 12-step program when I was being heavily sought out by a man who also attended the program. I thought, I've got this. I've learned so much already that I can handle this. That turned out to be one of the most toxic relationships I had ever been in. That person played on all my weaknesses and could beat me up emotionally like no one else had ever been able to. He was physical at times too. This man instilled a fear into me. He went to some of my friends and told many lies about me. He even hired someone to secretly follow me around. It took a little while, but with the help of my CR family, I was able to step away from this man. That CR family helped me to realize what unconditional love is to look like. I learned how God loves me and how he expects others to love me too. And I've learned how my actions and my behaviors affect my life in a positive way and in negative ways, as well as how they affect the lives of those that are around me too. And some of those CR family, they're still in my life today. During my 12-step program, I was able to unpack some of the root causes of the problems I faced. I got baptized again in 2014 when I was about halfway through the STEP program. I was feeling good, yet I was being convicted of something I hadn't shared. After digging my way down into my inventory, I discovered that I had a problem with lying. I lied to people to make my life look better than what it was. I lied as a child and a teen because I didn't want any of my friends to know that my dad was at the bar instead of being at whatever event I had going on. I lied to people about being too busy to do things with them just because I was afraid they would really want to get to know me, and I didn't want to disappoint them. God commands us in Colossians 3:9, "Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices." You see, to project a lie or exaggeration of ourselves to others is to declare that we value the opinion of a man over the opinion of God. Every time we work to create a better image of ourselves, we step outside of God's grace and the work for the love of a man. As I continued to work through the 12-step program, I was able to start loving myself again. I became closer to God more than I had ever been. I was able to forgive those who needed forgiving. I was able to make amends with several people and to finally find peace. Jesus has the power to help me uncover all of this and to heal all my issues. No matter how much God wants to heal us, we need to play our part and allow him to heal us. I like that I'm not judged here at Celebrate Recovery for what my behaviors have been. I've gained so much freedom from talking about my hurts, habits, and hang-ups, they are no longer a weight on my shoulders. Once we can be vulnerable and honest with where we are is when the true healing begins. Seeing how everything is connected in step study was a big part for me and allowed me to evaluate everything and know that the hole that I was trying to be filled needed to be filled with Christ. My old life belongs to a completely different person. Codependency and love and relationship addiction no longer run my life. I am no longer that mean-spirited individual. As I was going through the 12 steps, I was told by many people, including my employer, of the positive changes they were seeing in me. CR reminds me that the grace offered by Jesus is not a one-time transaction. It's a daily transaction. By working through the program, I was led to serve Christ as well. I began leading our women's group on Friday nights. Once I was finished my own STEP program, I was blessed by being able to provide hope and understanding to other women while leading them through their own CR STEP study program. CR has given me a team of people who are now my accountability partners and who I know are here for me if I ever need encouragement or motivation. God will meet you wherever you are, whenever you're ready, but you need to be ready to make the change. I'm a new person because of who Jesus is. Christ can heal your life, and he will encourage you every step that you make. You just need to begin taking those steps. I was doing a Bible plan last week, and I want to end here by sharing something with you from that study. It went on to say, the path to truly being loved starts with being honest before God and man. It starts with positioning ourselves to truly be loved by God. In his book, The Furious Longing of God by Brennan Manning, he describes what happens when we encounter God's furious longing for us. He says, the praise of others will not send your spirit soaring, nor will their criticism plunge you into a pit. Their rejection may make you sick, but it will not be a sickness unto death. God longs to set us free from the emotional roller coaster of living for the affirmation of man. God loves you where you are, as you are. You don't need to strive for the fleeting, burdensome affection of people any longer. The creator and sustainer of the entire universe is waiting right now to pour out love so rich and true that it will set you free from needing what the world has to offer you. If you're ready to turn to Christ and take the steps, please let one of us know. It's the end of my testimony, but I wanted to end tonight going into worship. I know we usually end that a different way, but tonight I wanted to end it going into worship with the next song. This isn't a song that you've probably heard too much. It's a Christian song, but I haven't heard it too much on a Christian radio station because it's a country song. If you don't want to stand, you don't have to stand. My rules tonight. I'm on stage. Worship the way you want to worship to this song. I just ask that you really pay attention to the words. Whether you need to look at the words and read them as they're being sung, you need to sit down and close your eyes so you can focus more on the words. If you have to kneel, this song is more of a prayer to God, asking him to guide your life and to lead you to the freedom. So go ahead and start the song. If you want to stand, go ahead. Find your own way to worship. Thank you.